Chapter 3. The Feast of Urks. Iggy fiddled with the piece of bone while he waited to be called. The feast had begun at sunset and had now been going for 3 hours. Darkness had closed in and clouds were racing across the full moon. For Iggy, it had been an agony of waiting. He could see smoke billowing into the sky and smell the delicious aroma of roasting meat.
Every now and then, someone would strike up the Urk war cry with the drums and 100 other voices would join in. Ooga ooga oogie, Urk Urk Urk, Ging Gang Gooly, Urk Urk Urk. No one was entirely sure what this meant, but the Urks had been bellowing it for generations. Iggy glanced at Hubba, who was pacing up and down, talking to himself. Snark sat alone on a rock, stifling a yawn as if killing snakes was something he could do in his sleep. Footsteps approached, and Iggy rose to his feet. It was Dad. "Ready?" he said. Iggy nodded. "Them are waiting. Got your axe?" "Yes." "Don't forget, aim for the head," Dad whispered. "That's the end with the eyes and teeth." "I know, Dad. And don't let them know you're scared. Snakes can smell your fear. Or is that wolves? I never can remember. Anyhow, what's that?" Dad pointed to the jawbone Iggy was fiddling with. A piece of lizard gut hung loose, stretched between the two ends. "It's nothing," said Iggy. Hubba stuck his head between them. "It's a clutterpult," he said. "Iggy made her. It's deadly." Dad frowned. It didn't look deadly to him. It looked like a scraggy old bit of bone. Just then they were interrupted by a deafening blast on a mammoth horn. "The chief," said Dad. "Better go." He looked at Iggy. "For Urk's sake, boy, don't try anything daft." Iggy stuffed the catapult inside his furs. To tell the truth, he wasn't at all sure this was going to work. Earlier, he had practiced with the catapult using a large boulder as a target. He'd scored 2 out of 10, and one of those was a lucky rebound. Still, it was better than his axe skills. They were led towards a standing stone. The tribe were gathered in a rough circle around the fire. Chief Hammerhead and the elders were seated in the place of honour closest to the stone. As the crowd parted to let the 3 boys through, Iggy felt eyes measuring him, which didn't take long as there wasn't much to measure. Chief Hammerhead was wearing his ceremonial necklace, the one made of whale bones. No one would have guessed that the chief and Iggy's dad were brothers. With his tangled red hair, Hammerhead looked like he'd been left out in the rain to go rusty. The Urks regarded hairiness as a sign of manliness, which was one reason why the chief was held in great respect. His chest was so hairy you could have made a dozen rugs from it. From the back, he looked like a bear. Sitting next to the chief was his daughter, Bulley. Iggy tried not to look at her in case he did that gormless staring with his mouth open thing. He wished his hands would stop shaking. The drumming died away and a hush fell over the gathering. Hammerhead raised his voice. "Friends, brothers, men of Urk!" A low growl came from the back rows. "And women of Urk," he added quickly. "Tonight, we has gathered to welcome 3 young warriors into the tribe. They wish to become sons of Urk." "Urk, Urk, Urk," chanted the crowd. The chief turned to the 3 candidates before him. "This is a night for courage, honour, and most of all, for killing snakes." The crowd roared their approval. It was always a pleasure seeing the younger members of the tribe, but it was even better watching a snake split in half. Iggy tried not to think about the ordeal ahead. He studied the faces behind Hammerhead, but found his eyes kept coming back to his cousin Bulley. Unlike most Urks, her hair was fair and looked as if it might even have been washed. Iggy thought it shone like sunbeams on a lake or like the skin of a lizard, although maybe he wouldn't tell her that. He tried to concentrate on the ceremony. Snark and Hubba were being presented to the chief. He was next. He reminded himself not to call him Uncle Ham. "Iggy!" boomed Hammerhead, crushing him in his arms. He looked him up and down. "Ah, well, plenty of time to grow, eh?" he said, bellowing as if Iggy was deaf. "So you want to be a son of a Urk?" Iggy nodded. "You swear to be a true Urk, to honour the tribe and serve your chief?" "I swear," said Iggy. "Splendid," beamed Hammerhead. "That's the dull bit over. Let's get you in that snake pit, eh?" Snake pit? Iggy's stomach lurched. His dad hadn't mentioned anything about snake pit. They were led over to a large muddy hole lit by a circle of flaming torches. It was as deep as a grave, which didn't strike Iggy as a cheering thought. At least it wasn't filled with a sea of writhing snakes. Iggy wondered when they were going to appear. He soon found out as a man stepped into the firelight carrying a bulging sack. It was Snark's father, Borg, chief elder of the tribe. He lifted the sack high above his head for the crowd to see. "Ooh," they gasped. The sack was jumping and rippling as if it was alive. Iggy felt he might be sick. At a signal from Hammerhead, the drumming began. The crowd pressed in to get a better view, forcing Iggy closer to the edge of the pit. He prayed that he wouldn't have to go first, but he needn't have worried. Snark always went first. Snark jumped down and landed in the pit with his long-handled axe at the ready. All eyes turned to Borg as he loosened the neck of the sack and fished inside with a forked stick. He pulled out a hissing snake which thrashed from side to side. It wasn't a very big snake. If Iggy hadn't known better, he would have said Borg had chosen his son the weediest snake he could find. It was a pale green grass snake, or maybe a puddle snake. It clung stubbornly to the stick as Borg dangled it over the pit. The drums beat faster as Borg shook it off and it fell through the air. Hardly had it touched the ground than Snark's axe came down with a sickening crunch. Something dark flew through the air and thudded against the side of the pit. It was the snake's head. Snark wiped a spot of blood off the blade of his axe and picked up the lifeless body. He raised it above his head like a trophy. "Urk, Urk, 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 Urk," chanted the crowd. Iggy noticed Ummerly smiling and whispering with her friends. Snark evidently had a lot of admirers. 3 seconds, muttered Hubba. "Pretty deadly, you got to admit." Iggy rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, it was a tiddler. My gran could have killed that." Hubba was up next. His opponent was a mud-coloured rock snake which coiled itself sleepily around the stick and didn't want to let go. When Borg finally shook it loose, it almost landed on Hubba's head. His tactics were messy, but effective. He jumped around hacking and swiping like a madman. By the end, there was blood and guts everywhere and very little left of the snake. Hubba was helped out of the pit, beaming triumphantly as the crowd cheered. Finally, it was Iggy's turn. He tried to ignore the way his heart was beating faster than the drums. At least the snakes he'd seen so far weren't big or poisonous. He edged closer to the pit and peered in. The next moment, someone shoved him in the back and he fell, landing flat on his face. Iggy heard laughter that sounded suspiciously like Snark. By the time he was on his feet, Borg was already fishing the next snake out of the sack. The front row gasped and took a step back. Iggy stared in horror. The snake was a monster. It looked like it ate scorpions for breakfast. What's more, it didn't seem too pleased to be dragged out of a sack and dangled over a muddy hole by a stick. "Wait!" cried Hubba. "That's a..." But Borg paid no attention at all and the snake landed in the pit with a heavy thump. Iggy leapt back. The snake raised its head and its pink tongue flickered out. "Iggy, don't move!" cried Hubba. "I don't think her's a grass snake." Iggy swallowed hard. "I guessed that," he murmured. "Isn't it one of them?" Hubba tried to remember. "Oh, you know. A black-bellied swamp snake?" It was Snark who had spoken. He crouched at the edge of the pit, peering into it. "Funny, you don't see him too often," he said. "Except in swamps, of course. Wonder how her got in the sack." Iggy thought he saw a sly look pass between Snark and his father. Maybe he had planned this all along. Is it poisonous? He breathed. Probably, said Snark. Maybe you should ask her. The snake was swaying from side to side in a hypnotic dance, its yellow eyes locked on Iggy. Don't just stand there, use your axe, boy, cried Dad. Iggy would have gladly used his axe, but the moment he made any sudden movement, the snake would strike, sinking its fangs into his arm, or somewhere more painful. Instead, he slowly reached his hand into his furs and brought out the catapult. His mouth turned dry. He had forgotten the one thing he needed: ammunition. Earlier, he had collected a stock of pebbles, but he'd used them all up in target practice. He was a sitting duck, and pretty soon he would be a dead duck. Glancing down, he spotted a couple of small stones lying in the mud. The problem was they were close to the snake. Very, very slowly, Iggy stooped and reached out a hand, keeping his eyes on his enemy. He could hear the fire crackling and the crowd holding their breath. Hubba watched through a crack in his fingers. Iggy's dad was holding his head in his hands. What on earth was the boy playing at? Iggy's fingers closed over the stones. Feverishly, he fitted one to his catapult. The swamp snake swayed as he took aim at the head. The stone belly flopped in the mud, falling hopelessly short. Startled, the snake darted its head forward inches from Iggy's face. Iggy fumbled with the catapult, trying to fit the second pebble. The snake's jaws were wide open, showing its tiny fangs. Iggy drew the sling back to breaking point and let fly. This time he lost his footing and stumbled backwards in the mud. When he opened his eyes, he could see rows of faces looking down at him from above. Had he missed? Was he bitten? A loud roaring filled his ears. Ugh, 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 ugh. Iggy propped himself on his elbows. The snake was lying dead, slumped on one side with eyes closed and fangs still bared. Ugh, ugh, ugh. He had done it! He'd actually killed a snake, and not some puny little grass snake, but a giant black-bellied swamp snake. He had proved himself a true son of Urk. Giddy with triumph, Iggy picked up the snake by the tail and swung it round his head a few times before letting it go. The swamp snake soared out of the pit and high into the sky. It snapped open its eyes in exactly the way that dead snakes don't. Up it rose and then began to fall. Flip! The snake landed like a cannonball in the chief's lap. It had been angry before, but now it was spitting mad. It reared up. Hammerhead yelled, and the next moment all hell broke loose. Seeing their chief's life in danger, the Urks rushed forward to protect him. With clubs and sticks, they rained down blows on the snake. When it was over, the swamp snake lay still. Hammerhead was stretched out in the dust, moaning faintly. There was a long, awkward silence, followed by an even longer one. "Chief!" said Borg, who had been the first to rush to Hammerhead's rescue, swinging a heavy club. "Chief, are you all right? Say something!" Said Hammerhead, who was covered in lumps and bruises. Borg shook his head gravely. He beckoned to some of the men, who came forward and carried their leader back to his cave. It took 6 of them. Shortly after, the rest of the tribe began to melt away, shaking their heads sadly and talking in low voices, until no one was left at all. Almost no one. "Hello!" cried Iggy from the bottom of the pit. "Can somebody help me out of here?"